Grant Whitmore almost walked past her. The snow was coming down harder now, thin and sharp, cutting across the estate like glass, and the last taillights from his Christmas gala had barely disappeared beyond the gates. His house behind him still glowed with chandeliers, music, and warmth. But out near the stone wall by the service entrance, something dark lay crumpled against the white. Grant slowed, his dress shoes sinking into the frozen slush. At first, he thought it was a discarded coat. Then it moved. His chest tightened. He stepped closer, and the porch light spilled across a face he recognized instantly. Naomi Ellison, his black maid, still in her thin black uniform. No scarf, no gloves. Snow clung to her lashes. Her lips had turned pale. Her hands were tucked under her arms so tightly they looked locked in place. For one awful second, Grant forgot how to breathe. She wasn't just cold. She was shutting down. And what hit him next was even worse. This hadn't happened on some random street corner. Naomi was freezing to death on his property. Just a few feet away from a mansion full of heat, wealth, and people who had all gone home comfortable. Someone had seen her. Someone had known. And somehow, no one had done a thing. Naomi Ellison was the kind of person most people never really saw, even when she was standing right in front of them. She moved quietly through Grant Whitmore's estate every day, arriving before sunrise, leaving long after the last guest had gone. Her presence marked only by the absence of mess. Glasses refilled before they emptied. Floors polished before footprints could settle. Chairs aligned before anyone noticed they had shifted. If something was out of place, Naomi fixed it. If something was needed, Naomi anticipated it. And if something was wrong with her, she kept that to herself. 3 weeks ago, the small apartment she had been renting on the edge of town slipped out of her reach. Rent had gone up. Her hours had been cut. And the last bit of money she had saved went somewhere else entirely. To the hospital where her mother lay hooked to machines that hummed day and night. Naomi never argued about it. She just paid what she could, signed what she had to, and left the rest to faith and endurance. At first, she slept in her car, a faded sedan that still smelled faintly like the vanilla air freshener she'd hung months ago. She folded her uniform carefully in the back seat, used a blanket thin enough to feel every drop in temperature, and set alarms so she could wake before the cold became dangerous. But the car stopped starting 4 nights ago. The engine turned once, then silence. After that, Naomi adapted the only way she knew how, by making herself smaller. She found corners, overhangs, spaces near buildings that blocked the wind just enough to buy a few hours. She learned which lights stayed on overnight and which doors were never checked. She never asked anyone for help. Not because she didn't need it, but because she had spent most of her life learning what happened when people decided you were asking for too much. At work, nothing changed. She still smiled softly when spoken to. Still said yes, sir, in that calm, steady voice. Still kept her uniform pressed, her hair neat, her posture straight. No one needed to know that her hands sometimes shook from hunger, or that she'd begun to calculate warmth the way other people calculated money. That night, during the party, Naomi had moved through the crowd like always, silent, efficient, invisible. When a little boy near the glass terrace started crying because his hands were too cold, she slipped off her own gloves and knelt beside him, warming his fingers between her palms until he stopped shaking. Later, she handed her untouched meal to one of the older staff members who hadn't had a break, brushing it off with a quiet, "I'm not that hungry." No one questioned it. No one noticed that she lingered near the kitchen doors a second longer than usual, letting the heat touch her face before stepping back into the cold corridors. By the time the last guests left, Naomi's body had already started to give signals she couldn't ignore. Slow reactions, shallow breaths, a heaviness in her limbs that made each step feel delayed. She should have gone somewhere warmer. She knew that. But the service entrance was close, and the stone wall there blocked most of the wind. Just for a moment, she told herself. Just until she could feel her fingers again. She sat down carefully, pulling her arms tight around her chest, pressing her chin into her shoulder to hold what little warmth she had left. The snow came quietly at first, settling into her hair, melting, then freezing again. Naomi kept her eyes open as long as she could. Then they closed. Not out of carelessness, but because her body had decided it needed rest more than it needed fear. Grant Whitmore had built a life so controlled that discomfort rarely made it past his front gate. His estate sat on 12 acres of private land just outside the city, all stone, glass, and quiet money. The kind of place where the driveway was heated so snow wouldn't stick, where imported lanterns lined the garden paths, where even the air inside seemed filtered of inconvenience. Everything in Grant's world worked exactly the way it was supposed to. Doors opened before he reached them. Cars were warmed before he stepped in. Dinner appeared without him asking. Problems were handled before they could rise high enough to interrupt his day. That was how he liked it. Efficient, predictable, clean. At 39, Grant had become the kind of billionaire people lowered their voices around. He owned investment firms, real estate, pieces of companies he never had to physically touch. His name carried enough weight that a single delayed email could make executives sweat. He wasn't loud about his power. He didn't need to be. It sat in the way people straightened when he entered a room, in the way assistants checked his expression before speaking, in the way entire evenings bent around his preferences without him ever having to say much at all. But what made Grant dangerous wasn't cruelty. It was distance. He had mastered the art of moving through the world without feeling responsible for what held it up. Staff existed in categories to him: security, kitchen, maintenance, housekeeping. Necessary. Replaceable. He knew names when it was useful. Faces when they were consistently around. But not stories. Never stories. He didn't ask where his employees went after midnight or what they returned to when they left his property. In Grant's mind, his responsibility ended where payroll began. If someone was struggling, he assumed there had been a mistake somewhere before him. A bad decision, a missed payment, a lack of discipline. Not his fault. Not his concern. It was the kind of belief that didn't feel cruel when you were rich enough to call it practicality. And that was what made the sight of Naomi in the snow so destabilizing. Because suddenly, the machinery of his life didn't look elegant anymore. It looked merciless. He turned and looked back at the house behind him. The glowing windows, the soft amber light spilling across the terrace, the faint echo of laughter still lingering from the gala that had just ended. Crystal glasses were probably still sitting half full inside. Expensive coats still draped over velvet chairs. His guests had spent the evening praising the wine, the string quartet, the imported winter roses flown in from Europe. Meanwhile, less than 100 feet away, a woman who had spent 12 hours serving that perfection had nearly frozen into the ground outside his wall. The contrast hit him like a physical blow. Naomi hadn't collapsed in some distant part of the city where tragedy could be filed under unfortunate. She had fallen here, on land he owned, in the shadow of the life he had built. And the ugliest part of it was this: nothing in his world had malfunctioned. The lights still worked. The fireplaces still burned. The staff still cleared the dishes. The system had done exactly what it had been designed to do. It had protected comfort at the top and ignored suffering beneath it. Grant stared at Naomi's motionless form, and for the first time in a very long time, wealth didn't feel like control. It felt like evidence. Grant moved before he fully thought it through. "Call Dr. Mercer. Now." His voice cut through the snow so sharply that the two valets near the front steps froze where they stood. One of them reached for his phone immediately. The other just stared. First at Grant, then at Naomi, like he was trying to decide whether this was really happening. Grant didn't wait for either of them to catch up. He dropped to one knee in the snow, his trousers soaking through instantly, and reached for Naomi's shoulder. She barely reacted. Her body was cold in a way that didn't feel human anymore, too still, too light under his hand. "Naomi," he said, lower this time, urgent now. "Naomi, can you hear me?" Her lashes fluttered once. Nothing more. A pulse of something ugly moved through his chest. Fear, but threaded with anger. Not at her. At the fact that she had gotten this far without anyone stopping it. He shrugged off his wool overcoat and wrapped it around her shoulders, but even that felt absurdly insufficient against the cold that had already settled deep into her body. When he slid one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her back, The nearest valet took a half step forward, startled. "Sir, I can get someone?" No, Grant's answer came too fast, too hard. He lifted her himself. Naomi's head tipped weakly against his chest, her breath so faint he had to feel for it. Snow caught in her hair. One of her shoes was damp through. Her fingers, tucked against her stomach, were rigid with cold. She felt fragile in a way that made him instinctively tighten his hold. Behind him, the front doors of the mansion opened and warm air spilled across the steps, carrying music, perfume, and the distant clink of glassware. It should have felt comforting. Instead, it made the contrast almost unbearable. Inside was a world built to keep winter out. Outside, Naomi had nearly disappeared in it. As Grant carried her through the foyer, conversations died mid-sentence. A few lingering guests turned and stared. One woman in a fur-lined coat actually gasped, hand lifting to her mouth. Not in concern, but in startled discomfort, like suffering had entered the room in a form too visible to ignore. Grant didn't slow down. "Move," he snapped, and people did. The house staff parted quickly, but not quickly enough to hide what he saw in some of their faces. Surprise, yes, but also recognition. They knew her. They knew she worked late. They knew enough to understand exactly how wrong this was. And still, somehow, Naomi had ended up in the snow alone. "East sitting room," Grant said, striding past the grand staircase. "Get blankets, dry towels, space heaters. Now." His house manager, Eleanor Pike, appeared from the hallway with a clipboard still in hand, her expression tight with confusion. "Mr. Whitmore, what happened?" Grant stopped so abruptly she nearly walked into him. Naomi shifted weakly in his arms, and for the first time, Eleanor's eyes dropped fully to her face. "That," Grant said, his voice flat with fury, "is exactly what I'm about to find out." Eleanor opened her mouth, then closed it. Good. He didn't want explanations yet. He wanted action. The east sitting room was one of the warmest rooms in the house, paneled in dark walnut with a stone fireplace that had been burning since late afternoon. Grant laid Naomi carefully across the long cream-colored sofa, and for one disorienting second, the image looked almost unreal. Her soaked black uniform against white upholstery, snow melting into the cashmere throw pillows, her body visibly trembling now that the heat had started reaching her skin. "Don't put her too close to the fire," came a voice from the doorway. Dr. Mercer, still in his coat, bag already in hand. He moved fast, kneeling beside Naomi and checking her pulse, her breathing, the temperature of her hands. "She's hypothermic," he said quietly. "Not severe yet, but she's close. We need to warm her gradually." Grant stood over them, jaw tight, every instinct in him demanding speed while every medical instruction required restraint. It felt unbearable to stand still while someone else touched the consequences of his own blind spot. A maid brought in towels. Another set down blankets. Someone adjusted the heater. The room filled with motion, but no one spoke above a whisper. Naomi's eyes opened briefly as Dr. Mercer rubbed warmth back into one of her hands. She looked dazed, disoriented, her gaze unfocused at first. Then it landed on Grant. For a second, confusion passed across her face. Then fear. Not panic. Not drama. Just that small, immediate fear people wear when they think they've made a mistake they can't afford. Her lips parted. Took effort for the words to come out. "I'm sorry, sir." Her voice was barely audible, rough and thin. "I didn't mean to sleep here." The room went still, completely still. Grant felt something inside him drop hard and deep. That was her first instinct. Not to ask for help. Not to say she was freezing. Not to explain that she had nowhere else to go. To apologize. As if the worst part of tonight was that she had inconvenienced him. He stared at her, unable to answer fast enough, while Dr. Mercer kept working and the fire cracked softly in the background. Naomi's eyes started to close again. "Stay with me," the doctor said gently. "You're okay." But Grant knew she wasn't okay. Not even close. Because whatever happened next, whatever he paid for, fixed, or ordered into place, one fact had already become impossible to undo. Naomi Ellison had been cold enough to nearly disappear, and it had taken collapsing in the snow for his world to finally notice her. The first crack came 20 minutes later. Not from Naomi, from the room. From the silence. Dr. Mercer had just finished checking her core temperature for the second time when he looked up at Grant and said, "She didn't get this cold in 10 minutes. The words landed hard. Clinical. Precise. Impossible to soften. Grant turned slowly toward the staff gathered just outside the doorway. Eleanor Pike, 2 kitchen maids, one of the valets, the night butler, and Marcus, the shift supervisor who handled all after-hours staff movement. No one met his eyes. That told him enough to start. "Who knew she was still here?" he asked. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The question moved through the room like pressure. Marcus cleared his throat first, but it wasn't courage. It was panic trying to organize itself. "Sir, the event ran over, and we were short on cleanup support, so some of the staff stayed later than expected." "That wasn't my question." Grant's tone cut through him cleanly. Marcus swallowed. "She was on terrace reset and service hallway sweep. She should have clocked out by 11:30. "Should have," Grant repeated. "Did she?" No answer. Eleanor stepped in carefully, the way people do when they sense someone else is about to collapse under scrutiny. "Her time card hasn't been closed yet." Grant stared at her. So she was still working. After midnight, in this weather, and no one checked where she went when the house closed. Eleanor's face tightened. The staff exit was locked after final vendor clearance. That did it. Grant's eyes moved to her fully now. Locked. It wasn't even a question. The older kitchen maid shifted uncomfortably near the hall table, clutching a folded dish towel in both hands. She looked like she wanted to disappear. Grant saw it. "Say what you know." She hesitated, then looked at Naomi lying half-conscious under 3 blankets. Shame won over fear by a fraction. "She asked if she could warm up in the laundry room before leaving," the woman said quietly. "Just for a little while." Marcus told her no. The room changed. You could feel it. Marcus turned so fast his shoes scraped the hardwood. "That's not how it was." "Then tell me how it was," Grant said, stepping toward him. Marcus straightened instinctively, but his voice still came out thinner than he wanted. "Sir, I was following policy. We had guests still on site. Staff can't linger in back-of-house areas after shift close without authorization." "Authorization?" Grant repeated, disbelief now mixing with anger. "She was freezing. We didn't know she was sleeping outside." "No," Grant said, colder now than the weather Naomi had come in from. "You just knew she had nowhere to go." That landed hard. Marcus's jaw flexed. She never said that directly. The sentence hung there like rot. Not denial. Not innocence. Just technical escape. Naomi didn't have to say it directly. Not when people with eyes had watched her keep coming in tired, underdressed, pale, too early, too late. Not when everyone in this room worked close enough to human struggle to recognize it on sight. Grant looked at each of them in turn, and the horror of it built not from one monstrous act, but from the accumulation of small permissions. Someone had noticed Naomi re-wearing damp shoes. Someone had seen her lingering near the boiler room on colder mornings. Someone had watched her decline dinner and pocket crackers from the service tray. Someone had heard her ask if there was any chance of an extra shift and understood exactly what desperation sounded like. And still, they let procedure answer where compassion should have. "Who else knew?" Grant asked. No one spoke. That silence was uglier than any excuse. "Who else?" he repeated. "Knew she didn't have somewhere warm to go tonight?" This time it was one of the valets. Young. Probably 23 at most. He looked sick. "I saw her in her car last week," he admitted, voice shaking. "In the lower lot. She was asleep in the back seat." Grant's head turned. "And?" The valet's face went red. "I thought maybe she was just resting between shifts." "In 30-degree weather?" The young man looked down. "No, sir." Dr. Mercer adjusted the blanket around Naomi's shoulders and said quietly, without looking up, "People see what lets them sleep at night." No one in the room moved. Naomi stirred faintly at the sound of voices, her brow pulling together as if even unconscious, tension still found her. Grant noticed immediately. "Lower your voices," he said. Then, after a beat, to no one and everyone at once. "She's apologizing for nearly dying on my property." The sentence didn't need volume. It hit anyway. Eleanor closed her eyes for a second, and when she opened them, something in her posture had shifted. Not enough to erase her role in this, but enough to suggest the truth had finally gotten under her skin. "There was a complaint," she said quietly. Grant turned. "From whom?" "One of the guests, Mrs. Davenport. She said Naomi smelled like cold air when she served champagne in the West Lounge." The words were so absurdly cruel that for a second Grant didn't process them. Then he did, and the room tilted into something darker. "What happened after the complaint?" Eleanor's throat moved before her voice did. "Marcus reassigned her away from the guest-facing floor." Grant looked back at Marcus. "Because she smelled like winter?" Marcus's face was draining now, his confidence gone. "Sir, I was trying to avoid a scene." "No," Grant said. "You were trying to protect the comfort of people warm enough to criticize the cold on someone else." Naomi made a small sound then. Not words, just a weak breath that caught wrong in her throat. Grant was beside the sofa instantly. Her fingers had started trembling harder now that feeling was returning, and the sight of it twisted something in him deeper than anger. She wasn't dramatic. She wasn't asking for attention. Her body was simply trying to recover from being ignored too long. He knelt beside her and pulled the blanket higher without thinking. Naomi's eyes opened halfway, unfocused, then found him again. Fear flickered first, then embarrassment. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, barely there. "For what?" The question escaped him before he could stop it. Naomi swallowed, her lips dry, her voice small enough to break a room if anyone was human enough to hear it. "For causing trouble." That was the moment it stopped being about negligence and became something worse. Because trouble, to Naomi, meant being visible, needing something, interrupting order. Grant looked at her face, at the woman who had worked in his house while quietly falling apart, and felt shame rise hot and immediate in a way he had no practice carrying. She had not asked to be rescued. She had simply run out of places to endure. Behind him, Marcus started to speak again, probably to defend himself, probably to hide inside policy one last time. Grant stood before he got the second word out. "You're done here," he said. Marcus blinked. "Sir." "Effective immediately." "Mr. Whitmore, with respect." "Don't," Grant said, and that single word held more force than shouting ever could have. "Do not stand in my house and explain to me how a woman ends up half frozen outside because nobody wanted to bend a rule." Marcus's mouth closed. Eleanor said nothing. No one did. Grant turned to the rest of them, his gaze landing not just on guilt, but on passivity, the quieter crime, the easier one. "Every person in this house who saw something and decided it wasn't their place." He let the sentence hang. No one needed help understanding the rest. The fire cracked behind him. Naomi lay pale under the blankets. And for the first time in a very long time, Grant Whitmore felt the full weight of what privilege actually looked like when stripped of elegance. It looked like a woman nearly freezing to death within sight of a heated floor. And it looked like a room full of people who had learned to call that normal. The house was quiet by the time the storm settled into a steady fall. Not silent, never silent, but quieter than a place that size usually allowed. The laughter was gone. The string quartet had long since packed up. Even the staff moved softer now, as if the walls themselves had heard what happened and were no longer willing to carry noise the same way. In the east sitting room, the fire burned low and constant, its light sliding across dark wood, polished brass, and the thick cream blanket tucked around Naomi Ellison's body. The room smelled faintly of cedar, wet wool, and chamomile. Dr. Mercer had left an hour ago with instructions to keep her warm, keep her hydrated, and keep things calm. Grant had done all three without once leaving the room. Naomi was awake now, but only in fragments. She hadn't fully sat up. hadn't asked for anything beyond a glass of water she'd apologized for needing. Her cheeks had regained a little color, but her hands still looked too fragile around the ceramic mug resting in her lap. Every few minutes, she would lift it with both palms and hold it there without drinking, like she was less interested in the tea than in the heat moving through the cup. Grant sat in the chair across from her, jacket off, tie loosened, sleeves rolled once at the forearms. He looked out of place in his own house like that, too still, too stripped of command. The fire snapped softly between them. Naomi kept her eyes lowered most of the time, not from guilt exactly, but from habit. The habit of taking up as little room as possible. She had changed into a plain knit set one of the housemaids had found for her, and her damp uniform now hung near the hearth, drying slowly beside her shoes. One of the soles had started peeling near the toe. Grant noticed it and looked away a second too late. Naomi followed his gaze, then quietly pulled the blanket lower as if to cover them. "You don't have to do that," he said. His voice came out softer than he expected. She looked up. "Do what?" "Hide things." The words stayed in the air for a second. Naomi's expression didn't change much, but something in her eyes tightened, then settled. "I'm not hiding anything, sir," she said gently. There was no edge in it, no accusation, just a truth she had lived inside long enough to make sound normal. Grant leaned back slowly, one hand resting against his mouth. Outside, snow brushed against the windows in light bursts, white against black glass. The room should have felt comfortable. Didn't. Not entirely. Comfort sat wrong when he kept picturing where she had been an hour earlier. Naomi finally took a small sip of tea. Her fingers trembled less now. "My mother hates winter," she said after a while, almost to herself. Grant looked up. It was the first thing she had offered without being asked. "She says cold gets into your bones and waits there." Grant didn't answer right away. Was she the reason? Naomi nodded once. For the extra shifts. For all of it. Her voice stayed steady, but there was fatigue underneath it now, the kind that didn't come from one night. "Dialysis isn't cheap, and she doesn't like when I tell her how bad things are, so I stopped telling her." Grant stared at the fire. "And tonight?" Naomi's eyes moved to the window. "Tonight I just needed somewhere the wind wouldn't hit so hard." The sentence was so small it almost disappeared. But it stayed with him more than anything else had. Not because it was dramatic, because it wasn't, because that had become her standard. Not safety, not rest, just less wind. The fire cracked again. Somewhere down the hall, a grandfather clock marked the hour. Naomi set the cup carefully on the side table, then folded her hands in her lap. "I should probably go," she said quietly. Grant looked at her so sharply she almost flinched. No, the answer came before he moderated it. He exhaled and tried again, lower this time. "You're not going anywhere tonight." Naomi blinked, uncertain, like even now she was trying to calculate the acceptable level of help. "I don't want to be a burden." Grant's jaw tightened at that word. Burden. As if she had somehow become heavier than the silence that had nearly killed her. He stood, crossed to the sofa, and bent just enough to lift the cashmere throw that had slipped from her shoulder. He placed it back around her carefully, not touching more than necessary, but enough to make the gesture clear. "Naomi," he said, and for the first time since she'd known him, his voice held no distance at all. "You are not a burden in this house." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and whatever she saw in his face made her go still. No apology came this time. No, yes, sir. Just a long, quiet pause while the snow kept falling beyond the glass and the firelight warmed the room inch by inch. Then Naomi lowered her eyes, not to disappear, but because she was suddenly too tired to keep holding herself together the way she always had. And for the first time that night, she let the blanket stay where it was. It happened quietly, not with a shout, not with a revelation spoken out loud, but with a piece of paper no one was meant to read. Naomi had drifted back into a shallow sleep, her breathing finally steady, her hands no longer trembling under the blanket. One of the housemaids, moving carefully to gather her damp uniform from beside the fire, reached into the pocket to check for anything that might be damaged by the heat. "Sir," she said softly, holding something small and folded between her fingers. Grant looked up. "What is it?" She hesitated, then stepped closer and handed it to him. It was a sheet of paper, worn, creased from being folded too many times. The edges softened, like it had been carried for days. Grant didn't open it right away. Something about it already felt too personal. But then he did. The handwriting was neat, careful, each word spaced like it mattered. "Mama, don't worry about me. The people I work for are good people. They take care of things. I'm safe here. I'll be okay this winter. I promise." Grant stopped reading. The room didn't change, but something inside it did. He read it again, slower this time. Every word landed heavier than the last. Good people. Safe. Okay this winter. The sentence echoed against everything he had just seen. Against the snow on her lashes. Against the locked doors. Against the silence of a house full of people who had chosen not to see. Grant lowered the paper slightly, his grip tightening just enough to crease it further. This wasn't a cry for help. It wasn't a complaint. It was a reassurance, written to protect someone else from worry, while she was the one quietly breaking. His chest rose once, then held. Naomi had believed in the goodness of this place more than the people inside it had lived up to, and that was the part that cut deeper than anything else. Not that she suffered, but that she trusted. Grant turned his head slightly, looking at her where she lay under the blanket, her face finally at rest, the tension gone for the first time since he had known her. She looked younger like this, not weak, just unguarded. Human, in a way his world had never allowed her to be. He folded the paper back along its original lines, more carefully this time, like it deserved respect now that he understood what it held. "She wrote that." Eleanor's voice came from behind him, barely above a whisper. Grant didn't answer immediately. When he did, it was low. "She wrote it to convince someone else she was safe." The words stayed in the air. No one moved. No one defended anything, because there was nothing left to defend. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a mistake that could be explained away with procedure or oversight. This was something else. Something structural. Something that had allowed a person to believe she was protected, while quietly leaving her out in the cold. Grant looked down at the letter one last time, then back at Naomi. And in that moment the shift was complete. Not in wealth, not in power, but in something far more dangerous. Because now he didn't just see her. He understood the cost of not seeing her sooner. And that changed everything. Grant Whitmore did not wait until morning to decide what kind of man he was going to be. By 7:30, the estate was already moving under a different kind of silence. Not the polished quiet of wealth, but the uneasy stillness that comes when a system realizes it has been seen too clearly. Eleanor had called in every department lead before sunrise. Security, house management, kitchen, grounds. No one sat. No one relaxed. Grant stood at the head of the breakfast room table in the same clothes he had worn the night before, his expression stripped of every trace of social polish. "Effective immediately," he said, his voice calm enough to make everyone listen harder. "Marcus Bell is terminated. So is anyone in supervisory staff who knew Naomi Ellison had no safe place to go and chose policy over judgment." No one argued. No one even tried. The weight in the room was too obvious now. He slid a folder across the table toward Eleanor. "This house is implementing emergency housing access for all overnight and late shift staff. Heated rest space. Meal protection. Transportation support. No employee leaves this property in dangerous weather without being accounted for. Not ever again." Eleanor looked down at the paperwork, then back at him, stunned by the speed of it. "And if someone needs help?" she asked quietly. Grant didn't hesitate. "Then they ask once." That was all. One sentence. But it landed harder than any speech could have. Upstairs, Naomi was awake when he knocked softly on the open door of the East guest suite. She was sitting near the window in borrowed clothes, her hair still slightly damp from the shower one of the housemaids had helped her take earlier. The room was warm, sunlit, and still. She looked healthier than she had the night before, but not fully steady yet. Recovery never happened as fast as rescue. Naomi looked up when he entered, then immediately began to rise. "No," Grant said gently. "Please don't." She paused, uncertain, then sat back down. The hesitation in her face hurt more than he expected. Like she still wasn't sure whether comfort was temporary, whether kindness had an expiration time. Grant crossed the room slowly and set a leather folder on the table beside her untouched tea. "Your mother's hospital balance has been cleared," he said. Naomi blinked once, then again. "What?" "Paid in full. This morning." She stared at him, not with excitement at first, but disbelief so complete it almost looked like fear. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." He held her gaze. "That's why it matters." Naomi's lips parted, but nothing came out. Her eyes dropped to the folder. Inside was more than the hospital receipt. A new employment agreement. Full benefits. A housing stipend. A salary adjustment that reflected what she should have been making long before now. And beneath that, something else. A recommendation packet for an internal operations training program run through one of Grant's companies. He had read her file before dawn. Not the surface version. The real one. Community college honors. Administrative certifications. Strong performance notes buried under years of service work. Naomi had never lacked ability. She had lacked margin. "I don't understand," she said finally, her voice unsteady in a way it hadn't been even in the cold. Grant looked at her for a long second before answering. "That's because this should have happened before you almost froze to death." The room went still. Naomi lowered her eyes, and for the first time since he had known her, she looked close to tears. Not dramatic, not broken, just tired enough to stop pretending she was untouched by any of this. "I wasn't trying to make anyone feel bad," she said softly. "I know." Grant's voice dropped with hers. "And that may be the most devastating part." Naomi looked up at that, really looked at him, and whatever she saw this time wasn't power. Not exactly. It was remorse, yes, but also something rarer. Responsibility. Not the performative kind. The kind that costs something. "You don't owe me gratitude," he said. "You were failed here, by people I hired, in a house I run. That's on me." Naomi's throat moved. "No one's ever said that to me before." Grant nodded once because he believed her, because that too felt like an indictment. She reached for the folder slowly, fingertips brushing the edge like she was afraid it might disappear if she touched it too quickly. Her hands were steady now. Warmer. Human again. "What if I messed this up?" she asked after a moment, eyes still on the papers. Grant almost smiled, but didn't. The moment was too honest for performance. "Then you'll be allowed to be a person while doing it." Naomi let out the smallest breath of something that wasn't quite laughter and wasn't quite crying either. Just release. Just disbelief softening around the edges. And for the first time since he had found her in the snow, Grant saw it happen in real time, the shift from survival to possibility. That night, the snow came down again. But this time, Naomi Ellison watched it from behind glass. She stood barefoot near the tall window of the East guest suite, both hands wrapped around a warm ceramic mug, the steam brushing softly against her face. Outside, the grounds of the Whitmore estate were buried in white, the stone wall near the service gate barely visible beneath the drift. Somewhere out there was the exact place where she had curled into herself and tried to make it through the night without asking anyone for anything. Now, just a few feet behind her, her old black shoes sat beside the fireplace, clean and drying, their cracked soles turned toward the heat like they, too, had finally been allowed to rest. Naomi looked at them for a long moment, then back at the snow. No tears, no speech, just a slow breath leaving her chest in the quiet. In the hallway, Grant Whitmore passed the open door and stopped when he saw her there, still and small against the amber light. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Naomi didn't turn around, but somehow, she knew he was there. And for the first time in a very long time, neither of them looked away.